What's up, y'all? Roy here, and you were listening to the Clems with a Z podcast. Now, there's a quote from the philosopher John Dewey. It's been sitting in the back of my mind for a while. The quote, he says, "If we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's, we rob them of tomorrow." Now, technically, he was talking about education, teachers, classrooms, schools. But the longer that I sit with this sentence, the more I realize that it applies to a lot more than education. I believe it applies to parenting, to culture, and to faith. Because if you've spent any time around Christianity, you've probably heard some version of this idea that we need to get back to the way that things used to be. And you don't only hear this in Christianity, you hear this in politics, you just hear this in the world, this going back to something. We need to get back to the early church, to biblical values, back to the faith of our fathers, family structures. And, I know that sometimes that instinct comes from a good place because tradition can carry wisdom and history matters. It does. But Dewey's quote raises an uncomfortable question for me. What if trying to recreate yesterday is actually preventing tomorrow? Because every generation inherits something from the one before it: beliefs, practices, stories, and wounds. And then we face a choice. Do we repeat what we were given, or do we let it evolve? And that tension shows up everywhere. It shows up on how we raise our kids, um, shows up in churches trying to hold on to tradition. It even shows up in the way we're trying to heal from our own past. Because the truth is, experience can become wisdom, but experience can also become projection. We take what shaped us, the good and the painful, and we assume that the next generation should walk through the same thing. The world that our kids are growing into isn't the world that we grew up in, which honestly is saying that makes me feel like my parents, because I can remember my parents saying stuff like that, you know? But anyway. But the question that Dewey's quote quietly asks is this: are we preparing people for the future or trying to preserve the past? And I want to talk about that tension, that pull between the past that shaped us and the future that's trying to emerge from it. Because there's something deeply human about looking to the past for answers. We all do it. I do it. When we don't know what to do, we look at what came before us. Maybe how our parents handled things, how our community handled things, how our traditions handled things. And sometimes, yes, that instinct does serve me and serves us well. Because every generation inherits two things from the one before it: wisdom and wounds. What I mean by that, the wisdom is the stuff that actually helped people survive, live, hard earned lessons, practices that brought stability, stories that carried meaning. But again, we don't just inherit wisdom from that, we inherit wounds too. Generational trauma gets carried down. Fears people carried, assumptions they made, the ways they protected themselves, the ways they sometimes hurt each other. And here's where the things get interesting. Because when we inherit both wisdom and wounds, we tend to respond in one of two ways. Some people just repeat the script. They say this is how it's always been done. Past becomes the blueprint, the authority, the thing that you don't question. But other people go in the opposite direction. They reject the script entirely. They say everything about the past was broken, and then so they flip it. New rules, new frameworks, new certainty. The thing I've been realizing more and more as I get older is that growth rarely comes from repeating the script, and rarely comes from flipping the script either. Because both of those responses, when you look at it, are still being controlled by the past. You have one clinging to it, and then you have another reacting against it. But both are still orbiting in the same gravity. Real growth usually requires something harder. It requires learning how to hold the past lightly, to let it inform us without letting it control us. To ask, what wisdom is worth carrying forward? And what wounds do we finally have the chance to heal? And like I said before, the tension shows up everywhere in families, cultures, politics, and definitely see it in religion. But one of the places that I feel The tension, most clearly from myself, is in parenting. Like a lot of people, I find myself looking back at my own childhood and just sorting through it. There are things that I'm deeply grateful for, moments that shaped me in ways that were good, things my parents gave me that I genuinely appreciate. But there's also things that were hard, things that left marks. And now that I'm a parent myself, I catch myself thinking about that balance a lot. Because if I'm honest, there's parts of my childhood that I don't really look to as a blueprint, especially when it comes to how religion showed up in my life growing up. For us, it wasn't something that we explored. It was something that was front loaded into everything: church, Bible studies, expectations, a very specific framework for how life was supposed to work. And a lot of that has shaped me in ways that I'm still unpacking. So when I think about raising my kid, there's this instinct in me that says I want them to have more than what I have: more freedom to explore, more space to become who they actually are, less pressure to fit into something that's already been decided. And sometimes that means I find myself doing things very differently than what my parents did. For example, spanking. My parents spanked me growing up. It was normal where I was raised. But that's not something that I'm doing with my kid. Not because I think my parents were monsters or terrible people, but because I've had the chance to reflect on what shaped me, how things have shaped me, and decide what I want to carry forward and what I don't. And honestly, if I'm being really transparent, when I look at how I parent, I probably swing pretty hard away from the past sometimes. Because when something hurts you, your instinct isn't just to adjust it, your instinct is to avoid it completely. And that's where this tension shows up again. Because even when we're rejecting the past, in ways the past is still shaping us. And that's a strange thing about that. When you become a parent, you think you're raising a child. But for me, even in the 6.5 years that I've been doing this, I find myself that I'm also confronting my own childhood. Memories that I haven't thought about in years start resurfacing. Moments that felt normal at the time suddenly look different when I'm imagining my own kid experiencing them. And you're probably doing that as well. And sometimes you catch yourself reacting to things that aren't even happening, not because of your child, but because of the younger self, the younger version of yourself that lives somewhere in that background. Which means one of the hardest parts of parenting that I'm finding isn't just learning how to guide your kid. It's learning how to recognize when I'm actually responding to my past instead of the child standing right in front of me. Because my kid isn't me, and your kids aren't yours, aren't you? And the world they're growing into isn't the world that we grew up in. And if I'm not careful, I can end up doing something that I never intended. And I can spend so much energy trying to correct my childhood that I actually forget to see theirs. But this pattern doesn't just show up in parenting, you see it in faith communities all the time. Because religion, like families, carries a lot of history. Every tradition was shaped in a particular moment, a particular culture, a particular set of fears, a particular understanding of how the world worked. And those moments mattered. They shaped the practices, they shaped the theology, the way people understood God and themselves. But over time, something interesting happens. What began as responses to a specific moment in history slowly becomes permanent frameworks. The answers that help people navigate one generation's world start getting treated like they are the answers for every generation's world. And when things begin to shift and culture changes and new questions arise, you often see communities moving in one or two directions. Some abandon everything. They assume the past was the problem. They burn it down and start over. Other communities go in the opposite direction. They cling to the past even tighter. They double down. They say things like, we need to get back to the way things used to be. To the early church, the early biblical values, the faith of our fathers. And that instinct can come from a sincere place. Because yes, tradition carries wisdom, stories passed down through generations matter. But the question that Dewey's quote raises is, like I said before, what happens when trying to recreate yesterday starts preventing tomorrow? Because faith, at its best, isn't supposed to freeze a moment in time. It's supposed to help us and help people wrestle with the deepest questions of being human. And those questions don't stop evolving. Every generation faces new and different realities, different pressures, different challenges, which means the task of faith can't just be repeating answers. It has to include the courage to ask new questions. And sometimes that's where the tension begins. Because for some communities, asking new questions feels dangerous, but the alternative can just be as risky. If our faith can only survive by repeating yesterday's answers, then it may not be strong enough for tomorrow's questions. And honestly, this dynamic isn't just about institutions or traditions, because it shows up inside of us as well. Because the same thing that happens in families and churches also happens inside of the human heart. Because the truth is, past doesn't just shape what we remember, it shapes what we expect, it shapes what we fear, and it shapes what feels safe to us. If we're not paying attention, and if we're not, those experiences can slowly turn into worldviews. If someone grew up in chaos, they might spend their whole life trying to control everything around them. If someone grew up in a really rigid environment, they might swing all the way to the opposite extreme and reject everything that feels structured. If someone grew up being shamed, they might spend the rest of their life trying to build a world where shame doesn't exist at all. And honestly, those some of those shifts are healthy. Sometimes they're exactly what healing requires. But sometimes we're not actually healing. We're just reacting. One rule book just gets replaced by another. One certainty replaces a different certainty. And the strange thing is, both of those reactions are still being shaped by the same past. One repeats it, the other resists it. Both are still orbiting around it. And I catch myself in this more than I'd like to admit. There are moments when I can feel how much my past is still living inside my instincts, how quickly certain things trigger me, how certain situations bring up old fears and old angers. And sometimes I have to just stop myself and ask a hard question. Am I responding to what is actually happening right now? Or am I responding to something that happened years ago? Because if I'm honest, a lot of the work of healing for me has just been trying to make sure my past hurts don't define my heart. Trying not to let old wounds turn into permanent lenses for how I see the world. That's a lot harder than it sounds because wounds want to protect themselves. They want to build rules, they want to create certainty. Growth often asks something different of us. It asks us to understand the past without letting it imprison the future. And maybe that's what Dewey's quote is really pointing toward. Not just better teaching, but a different relationship with the past itself. Because, yes, past matters. It shaped us, it gave us language, traditions, instincts. Not in sync, the band, instincts. And it also gave us stories. It gave us wisdom that was often hard earned, but it also gave us wounds. And if we're not careful, both of those things, our wisdom and our wounds, can quietly become scripts that we hand to the next generation without even realizing it. Scripts about what life was supposed to look like, scripts about what faith is supposed to look like, scripts about what it means to be a parent, a partner, or a human being trying to make sense of the world. But the truth is, tomorrow is never built by perfectly recreating yesterday. As the world keeps changing, new questions emerge, new realities show up. New people come into the world with their own paths and their own stories to live. And maybe part of the maturity, whether it's a parent, a person of faith, or just a human being trying to grow, is learning how to hold the past with gratitude without gripping it so tightly that nothing new can grow. To carry forward the wisdom and to heal the wounds and to leave space for the future to become something we could we could not have fully imagined. Because tomorrow isn't built by repeating yesterday, it's built by learning from it. So maybe the question for all of us is this, and simple. Where in your life might yesterday still be writing the script? Where might the past be quietly limiting what the future could become? Because every generation, like I said, inherits two things from the one that came before it: wisdom and wounds. And what we do with both of those things might shape tomorrow more than we realize. And maybe the even deeper invitation is this: how do we let yesterday shape us without limiting what tomorrow could become? So thanks so much for listening to today's episode of Clemens with a Z. If something in this conversation resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at clemenswithaz@gmail.com or send me a DM over on Instagram at the Clemens with a Z podcast page. If you want to support the podcast, the easiest way you can do that is by subscribing, rating, and leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can share it with a friend, post on your socials, drop in a group chat. All of it helps more than you know. But if you want to support the podcast financially, you can head over to clemenswithaz.com. There's a merch store with things like shirts, stickers, all kinds of stuff. You can donate directly also through the GoFundMe. The link's in the show notes. Every little bit goes a long way in helping me keep these conversations going. And if you're looking for something a little bit more regular, or you're a reader, not a listener, check out my Substack, Devotions for the Disillusioned and the Deconstructing. That's where I share short reflections, devotionals, and some extra behind the scenes thoughts that don't always make it onto the podcast. This podcast keeps going because of all you listeners showing up, engaging, and passing it on. So thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And thanks for being a part of this messy middle with me. So until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other. Peace.